Let's turn to Ruth chapter 4, the passage that we read just a short time ago. Life's like a tapestry, but we see it from the back. It's those knotty threads, those colours interwoven, but we don't see how the picture fits together. Occasionally we get an idea of what the pattern might be like. But that's the reality of life so often. All our human friendships, relationships, efforts at school and work experience, successes and failures, the tapestry of our lives that weave together. Sometimes we gain a sense of perspective and it's on the ordinary level and we get it and we understand what's going on. On other occasions we're puzzled and confused. Sometimes from the heart we cry out, God, why is this happening? And like Job of old, we may not get an answer. This story began with 3 funerals and 3 widows and not a wedding in sight. The chances of it ending happily ever after seem totally remote. Yet out of the tragedy, God was at work. God was to bring something good beyond their expectations. There are times when we suffer the untimely death of a loved one, maybe the irreversible breakdown of a marriage or relationship, a bitterly disappointing business failure in which years of personal investment of time and effort and money or love in the relationship context, and for what we may think. Or in the midst of some other trying circumstances as we try and make sense of what is going on. And in our darker moments we wonder, how can any good come out of this situation? Here was one that would fit that scenario. In Moab, the older woman and the younger woman weeping together at what they had lost. And Naomi effectively thinking she's going home effectively just to exist until she passes on. But Ruth wants to go with her and said, I'm not going to leave you. She commits her life to the God of Israel, to Naomi's God, and said, I will trust him to take care of our future. She doesn't understand or know what will happen. She's almost certainly, in her own mind, giving up the prospect of marriage and family and future, but trusting that God will somehow make a way into her future. And they walk the 60, 70 or so miles to Bethlehem into that uncertain future, relying only on God. Stepping out with their tears. We know the ending of the story. We know how it finished. And so we can fast forward from the heartache and grief and struggle that went on for some years to the happy place. But life is not the quick movement from the sad and the tough to the happy places. It's more complicated, more difficult and more challenging than that. But the God who loves us beyond measure is with us in those journeys, in those places. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament in Romans 8 writes, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all. How will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Do you need to embrace these words of assurance today? So it's a day to be remembered. Ruth and Naomi are at the house. In the culture of that day, they're not directly physically involved. They have to wait to see what happens. And you have to remember, Ruth's expecting that at some point she's going to get married. But it's not like me finding out in Toronto the date of my daughter's rearranged date for the wedding, and it's now next week. She didn't even know who it was she was going to marry. And that's a big deal, a seriously big deal. It takes place outside the city gates, or the village gates, we should say. Bethlehem was a village back then, not the big city it is on the West Bank today. Justice was served, it was a public meeting place. There's no town halls or fancy buildings, everyone did their business in the open air at the city gates. The king would be there if there was a king in a place. The poor and needy would ask for assistance. And yet, even diplomatic business, in a later time, King Ahab and King Jehoshaphat are discussing whether to declare war, and they're having their chats with their advisors, and the general public could show up and listen. In Deuteronomy 25, there's a situation like the situation that Boaz is going to have. And clearly, the kinsman redeemer in that context is not keen on taking up his responsibilities. And in Deuteronomy 25, they gave a warning that that man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. But fast forward to 3,200 years ago, to the time of Boaz, inviting the elders and others to witness a meeting at the gates of Bethlehem. This man comes up to the place. Now, I don't know whether he'd gone out to do some, I was going to say shopping, but there wouldn't have been shops to go to. But whatever daily business he'd left home from, it was not what was to transpire that day. And Boaz says, "Friend, will you come and sit down? There's some property for sale. Definitely land, possibly the house where Ruth and Naomi were staying." And he says to the man, "You're the nearest relative. You've got first option on buying it." Now, buying land or a house, that's quite a big deal. If the property is sold within the clan, then it remains within the family after the year of Jubilee every 50 years in Israel. So Boaz, in effect, asked the man to pay an income to Naomi until the Jubilee or to her death, whichever comes first. Naomi's too old to bear children, so the land on her death would revert to this man's branch of the clan. So it's the equivalent of paying a mortgage on a house for a relative today. It's not a light sum of money. It actually asks the question, in terms of help, although our culture's different, in helping relatives and other people that we know, it's quite a challenge. How much will we be prepared to put ourselves out to provide for others and their needs? There's no easy answers in this situation. The challenges may be different. People live longer today, but how we care for others in our families and provide for them, these are not easy questions to answer, but they're ones we have to consider. So the man said yes, he'll buy the property. But then there's the challenge that Boaz says. But just before we go on to that, Boaz's heart must have skipped a beat, because he's wanted to marry Ruth. And the man, it appears, with some kind of enthusiasm, says, yeah, he's happy to buy the field, or possibly a house with it. And then Boaz says, well, it's not just land, a house. You've also got to acquire the dead man's widow, so you're going to have another wife. This changes the whole picture. Not only would an income have to be provided for Naomi, but the additional duty of seeking to procreate a child with Ruth at his own expense, a male child that would inherit the property and gain the benefit from it. In effect, his own descendants would not profit from it, so it would just be a cost. He would have no long-term gain for his branch of the family. Even apart from the conversation of going home to his wife and saying, I've just got another wife as well as a house and a field. Now that would be some conversation. And he says, I just can't do it. The cost had increased significantly. Now that was the answer Boaz wanted, and the answer in God's providence that was the right one. And of course then it allows Boaz to step forward. Boaz was a type of Christ, showing the ideal characteristics of the kinsman redeemer. He was a close relative. He was someone who was in a position to do what was needed for Ruth and Naomi. For our salvation, Jesus is the one who could do what was needed. He was the one in place to do that. He was also able to redeem. Some close relatives may want to help in a situation of need. A kidney transplant, a blood donation, or bone marrow donors. But sometimes people are not a match and they can't do it. So the desire's there, but it's not possible. Boaz had the physical means, the money, and he was willing to redeem. People can have the resources but not be willing to do it. This man, who was the first relative, it was too much for him to do it, but Boaz was able to do it and wanted to do it. There's secondly a divine plan that will not be forgotten more briefly. It was to be a blessing to Boaz. Now, this culture of legal transactions with sandals was already out of date by the time the book of Ruth was written. So there's the explanation by the editor of the book or the writer of the book that says, actually, this isn't how we do legal transactions, but this is how they did those centuries ago. They handed over a sandal rather than the legal documents that we would have today. But what a moment as he received that sandal. The man giving up his rights and allowing God's plan to take place. Ruth had sacrificed everything to care for Naomi and put her first. Boaz, seeing Ruth coming into the field, went above and beyond in giving her extra grain to support her and Naomi. And God would bring good out of their generosity and godly hearts to care for others. God would reward his and her commitment to serving others and putting them first. It was a blessing to Bethlehem. The sense of community in that context is far greater than we would have in many urban locations today. Some rural communities are very strong ties of people together sharing in joys and sorrows, but it's not so common in other places. The leaders of the town prayed or proclaimed 3 blessings over the union of Boaz and Ruth in the context of being a blessing to Bethlehem. So may the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah. These ladies are the 2 wives of Jacob from whom the nation of Israel were descended. In essence, may they make your descendants of this marriage be even more significant than the ones before. My goodness me, how that came true with the great King David and the Lord Jesus himself in the lineage. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem, an aspiration for Boaz as husband. This Bethlehem was Bethlehem Ephrata. There was another Bethlehem up in the territory of Ephraim in the north of the country. During the time of famine, Boaz could have left. He had the means. But he stayed. Did he do that for the good of the community? We'll never know, but possibly. But they're saying, may he be blessed for staying through the hard times, if that's what was the case. Through the offspring of the Lord given you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. This is a reference back to the complex and painful story of Genesis 38. Another tragic family situation out of which God brought good. Now, it's very possible Ruth possibly married to Mahlon for up to 10 years and there were no children. It's very likely Boaz was previously married, but again, we have no evidence of any children. In that context, very culturally expected and surprising that was not the case. And yet, out of the heartache, the tragedy, the disappointments of the past, God would bless the union of this marriage with children, or at least a child that the story focuses on in Obed. In our land, please pray for the couples that struggle to conceive children naturally. Some have opportunities to foster or adopt, but these things are not easy situations to deal with. They can be very, very difficult. And it's a blessing to Naomi. She took the child that would be born of this marriage in her arms and cared for him. A lady who came back to Bethlehem and said, "Call me Mara." She could not see a future. But now as she holds baby Obed in her arms, she feels blessed. In Romans 8, words that are so appropriate. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. All things in themselves are not good. Some things in life are very, very difficult. But to believe and trust that God can bring good out of all situations is something that is important. And lastly, a blessing to Israel. The genealogy at the end of the book to us is not, at one level, the most exciting thing to read. Paul has to warn Timothy in 1 Timothy about people who spend too much time in genealogies. Well, it's not an issue in our culture. I'm sure that's not an issue for us. But they're there as a statement in the Bible of the goodness of God, of the blessing of family and descendants, which in itself is a good thing. But it points forward to the incredible genealogy at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel that includes the 5 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, in the genealogy for Jesus. That image of the tapestry that I mentioned at the beginning, the people that came into the line from which Jesus would be born had different ethnic backgrounds, of different social backgrounds and different cultural backgrounds. But in the purposes of God, they came together. And the story doesn't end there in the New Testament. Paul tells us that we as Gentiles are joined with Jews in the family of God. We are of the faith of Abraham, Romans 4:16. He is the father of us all. The message of the story of Ruth is that God works for good in even the most unlikely and unpromising of situations. May we trust him as they did for Jesus' sake. Amen. I have a couple of questions for reflection before we come to communion.